Now, to make sense of holiness and the way it works, the way God communicates holiness to us and what the problems are associated with this, we need to understand four realities. Four realities. Just to give you the Hebrew first of all, and then we'll look at the key passage and unpack it. First of all, HaKodesh, the holy thing. What is holy? And ultimately, only God is holy. That's the key. And then the opposite of holiness is not uncleanness or impurity, but is HaKol. That is the common thing. What is common? They are the first pair of terms. Then you get the second opposites, which in the ancient and modern world were themselves not theological, but basically physical and sociological. Hatamei, the unclean thing. What is unclean? The pollutant. Pollutant? Yeah, the polluting thing. And then the opposite of the polluting thing, the pollutant, is the purifying thing, the purificant. Hatachor, the clean thing, the holy thing. The clean thing, the what is clean or pure. Let's go now to Leviticus chapter 10 to 12. Here, at the time where Nadab and Abihu desecrated God's holiness on the same day that God inaugurated the divine service. So the day that God inaugurated the divine service, you had the two sons of the high priest Aaron, did some creative improvisation, offered incense without the most holy coals, and were struck dead because they desecrated God's holiness. And it's in connection with that we get this basic mandate given to Aaron, and this summarizes what the task of a priest is. And if you like, it summarizes your task, those of you who are going to be pastors. Josh, can you read? Or is it your turn, I think, isn't it?
Yep.
Leviticus 10 to 12.
You must distinguish between the holy and the common, between the unclean and the clean. And you must teach the Israelites all the decrees the Lord has given them through Moses.
So, the task of the priest is to distinguish holy from common, clean, unclean from clean, and to teach the people, if you like, basically how to do it according to the decrees that God gave to Moses. So the task of the priest is to be a custodian, caretaker of God's holiness. That's their mandate. Now, what's meant by these terms? Holy is what is divine, what's in God's presence. So God himself is holy, so it has to do with God, and therefore anything to do with God, what's divine, is holy. Anything that is in God's presence, in contact with God, shares in his holiness. Now, that's never defined because it can't be defined. The only definition we get of holiness is the architecture of the tabernacle and the commands given about the Israelites' participation in God's holiness. So God defines his holiness not theoretically but practically. Likewise for us. Where do we get a practical definition of Christ's holiness? In the divine service. And that's what makes the divine service so very important, and that we get it right according to God's word, because otherwise we interfere with God's holiness. Now, what's opposite to that is what's common, HaKol. Now, in my translation of the NIV, I have a most unfortunate way of translating, which is what is profane. Now, profane for us is the same as what is unclean. But HaKol isn't unclean. Hakol is what belongs to human beings, what's common, that which is permitted for human use in the order of creation. So, for example, sex. Human sexuality is not holy, it is not unclean. In itself, it is common. It can become unclean, it can be sanctified. Now, the general rule is anything that God has created is common. It belongs to humanity. It can be sanctified. It can be sanctified and drawn into God's presence and used by God for his purposes. So, sex in itself is common. The food we eat, bread, apples, so on, are common food. However, that common food can be sanctified. In Holy Communion, the bread is sanctified and becomes the body of Christ. Right, so what's common is that which belongs to humanity, the realm of humanity, the order of creation. Now, in contrast to that, you get the second pair. That's the first pair, and you need to take these two together. You get the second pair. That which is unclean, the unclean thing. Now, the unclean thing is that which is disorderly and forbidden because it's disorderly, that which disrupts God's order of creation. So, if something is right in the order of creation, it is clean. If it is wrong, it is unclean. It is what is unnatural, perverted in the order of creation. Let me give you two cases, one fairly common, the other one more extreme. God created our bodies to be healthy. Sickness is abnormal. It's not the norm for created human beings. Therefore, sickness is unclean. Right? God created us, designed us sexually to interact with the opposite sex. And if we use our sexual organs on the same sex, we are perverting, disordering the order of creation. So homosexual acts of homosexual intercourse, not homosexuality, not the orientation, but homosexual acts are unclean, and they make people unclean. They pollute, they defile. The opposite of what's unclean is the clean. And there's an overlap between clean and common. Clean is what's the proper natural condition of something common. So bread in itself, provided it's not poisonous or poisoned, is clean. Sexual intercourse in marriage is clean. Clean sex. We still use that kind of terminology. Now, to get the basic thing. Now, anything that is common is either clean or unclean. So, anything that is common can either be clean or unclean. So, take sex, it can be clean or unclean. Food can be clean or unclean. Now, anything that is common can be made holy and share God's holiness, but before it can be made holy, it needs to be purified. It must cease to be unclean. Right, now, what happens then, when God's presence, when God comes with and places his presence with his people and joins his people, you get the creation of three spheres, three environments, if I can put it, three habitats. God's holy presence on earth creates, first of all, a holy, clean domain. If you want to term it in Lutheran theology, this is the kingdom of the right hand, the church. Now, what was the holy, clean domain in Israel? The tabernacle enclosed by the courtyard. That's the holy, clean domain. Anybody who came into there had to be in state of ritual purity. Everything unclean was excluded from it. In fact, the whole camp was supposed to be a holy, clean environment, so anything unclean was to go outside the camp. The second domain is the clean but common domain. That's ordinary secular life. That's the kingdom, Luther's kingdom of the left hand, the kingdom of society, of government. It's not the kingdom, the kingdom of the left is not the kingdom of Satan, it's God's kingdom. It's where things work in the order of creation according to the way they're meant to work in the order of creation. Then you get the third domain, which is the unclean common domain, which is the realm of Satan. So, if I can represent it diagrammatically, we have this. And this puts it in abstract terms, because notice God doesn't explain it like this, but he just merely gives them the tabernacle and the laws to do with worship. And it's all mapped out there practically for them, not theoretically like this, but we like to theorize about things, so I better do it that way. You get God's presence with his people, and where God is, you have a holy, clean domain. And then the opposite to that, counter to that, is the common unclean domain, which is the realm of the evil powers. Now what's interesting is that nowhere in the Old Testament is this explicitly named as the realm of Satan. There's hints that it is the demonic realm, but it's deliberately avoided the naming of the power, the evil power behind the evil powers. But there are evil powers, the powers of darkness rather than light. So wherever you have the evil powers, they create a bridgehead within God's creation. They take what is common and they defile it. And that's the way they work. Now that's the key to understanding Satan, evil spirits, the whole demonic realm, is that they work in impurity. Do you know what the commonest term for demons is in the New Testament? It's not demons, it's unclean spirits, because they work in impurity, spiritual impurity. The unclean domain, it's still within the order of creation, because what they do is take the good order and pervert it. You take something good, like sexuality, and you pervert it. And between those two, then, you get the clean common domain, which is the order of creation working the way it's meant to work. Now, corresponding to those three domains, you get the following actions and terms. Anything that is holy can be desecrated. Desecration means taking from this holy state and making it a common. Now, this can be legitimate and illegitimate. So, for example, you can desecrate a church in the sense that you don't need it anymore, and you remove all the holy things and it becomes no longer a church, but it's just a shop or house or something like that. That's legitimate desanctification. Or take another case of legitimate desanctification. Every firstborn male child is holy to God, belongs to this domain. Now what's the problem? He's needed at home on the family farm to start off a new family. So therefore, what do parents do? They buy him back, and so he becomes common. So what's holy becomes common. But most cases, desecration involves sacrilege, the desecrating of what's holy, and that's the first stage then towards defiling what's holy. Anything that is common can then in turn be defiled, made unclean. Now, for some reason, it's the obsession and the nature of evil that it lives off what is not only what is good here, but it lives off parasitically what is holy and gains its power from desecrating what's good and desecrating what's holy and defiling what is good. So you get the term desecration, you get the term pollution, defilement. With me, there's lots of other synonyms for that. Making unclean. Now, human beings do this. On the other hand, what human beings do, God undoes. So what's God's purpose with his people? What's God's purpose for the whole of his creation? He wants to purify what is unclean. Things that are common, he wants to purify. And he purifies then in order to sanctify what has been made clean. So you have purification, sanctification. Now there's a lot of confusion where people collapse these two together and collapse these two together. Can you see they are connected? You can't sanctify, God can't sanctify without purifying, but purifying in itself doesn't sanctify. Likewise, you can't defile something that's holy before it is desecrated. But desecration is usually connected with defilement. Or you can have defilement which doesn't have anything to do with anything holy. So you get 4 changes of status before God. And we're dealing here with states of being. We're thinking, Tom, you like philosophy, ontology, states of being, the way things are. First of all, desecration involves the transference of something holy into a common state, the redemption of a firstborn male child. Secondly, you have defilement, pollution, contamination. That involves the transference of something clean into an unclean state. So a person can eat mutton and it doesn't affect them, their purity. But if you eat pork, you defile yourself. You make yourself unclean. If you touch the corpse of somebody who's died, you become unclean. Now that's rather strange. Why is this? I want to deal with that shortly. But just notice then, what defilement means: taking something that is clean and making it unclean. Purification involves the transference of something into a clean state, a pure state. So the blood from menstruating makes a woman unclean. It's at the end of that period of menstruation, she takes a bath and then she becomes clean. Very simple. Or let's say you have a wet dream and you have an ejaculation of semen. That semen makes you unclean. But if you have a bath, wash yourself, then you become clean. So washing, cleansing. That's just one very simple form of cleansing, a very low level kind of impurity. Then you get sanctification. Involves the transference of something that's clean into a holy state. So you can bring a clean animal like a sheep or a goat or a calf, present it to God, slaughter it and place part of that animal on the altar, and that whole animal becomes holy. And you, through that animal, share then in some way in God's holiness. Okay, any questions on that? Yep.
Just a little one just about, it's just interesting that then when Jesus, people who are unclean come into contact.
That's right.
And they're purified and sanctified at the same time.
That's right, but what does this do to Jesus? We see that. Look, if you want to make sense of almost every story in the Gospels, run this grid over them to see what Jesus does and what people's doing. A leper comes, touches Jesus, what happens? Map it out. Jesus is most holy, he's also clean, therefore what happens? That leper touches Jesus, becomes clean, and doesn't just become clean, but becomes holy. But what does Jesus become? he takes on the impurity, he's defiled, and his holiness is desecrated. And if his holiness is desecrated, what is inevitably going to happen? He will become so unclean that he will have to die. So the moment Jesus comes after his baptism, comes into contact with the first unclean person or thing, his death is inevitable. What you have there is involved in the great exchange. Jesus gives us people his holiness, his purity, and he takes on their impurity. He takes on their death, their unholiness on himself. Okay?
Usually if someone's unclean and comes into the most holy, they'd be killed.
They would be killed, yes. But that's the whole point. Except you realise that, and I explained with priests, it works that God had established the priesthood as for the benefit of the lay people, so that if they came into God's presence and they defiled and desecrated the holy things, who would be punished for it? Who would bear iniquity? The Levites would bear it for the people, the priests for the Levites, and who would bear it for the Levites? The high priest. And who bears it for the high priest once a year? The scapegoat. Otherwise you wouldn't have any priests left. But all that points to the great high priest, Jesus, who bears our iniquities. And that means that he takes on our death, so he can give us his life. There's that great exchange that occurs in Jesus. Now I'd like to, any questions on that? I'd like to map out to you the reality of impurity. And I'd urge you to get your heads around this, because you will be dealing more and more with this in ministering to people. If there's one thing, if I can see, that's happened in the 40-something years I've been a pastor, it's just more and more of my work happens to be in this area. And as far as I'm concerned, this theology of holiness and purification is essential for mission work to people in Australia, but also overseas to almost every culture I could care to name. This is the key to work. Now, what's impurity? One of the most brilliant books that's been published last century is by Mary Douglas, a social anthropologist, called Purity and Danger. I would urge you to read it, because it makes sense of so much in our society that otherwise doesn't make sense. Can I give you 3 phenomena? Back in the 1900s, people had discovered that infection came from germs. And they found it almost impossible to sell the concept of a germ to ordinary people until somebody hit on the idea of identifying germs with what was dirty and health with what is clean. Once they did that, it sold itself. Clean, unclean. Mary Douglas claims that if there is a universal social category that runs across all society, and it's built into our bodies, it's built into the way we are physically, it's the distinction between what's clean, that's inside us, and what's unclean comes from outside us. A brilliant analysis. And she studied many societies and says it fits all societies. All societies are built around this clean, unclean grid. Okay, second case in point. Hitler had some wacky ideas about eugenics and about Jews being the cause of all trouble. Initially, he didn't get any hearing until he identified Jews with being unclean, and then it sold itself. Jews unclean, and who are the clean race? The Aryans are clean, Jews are unclean, and everybody else is sort of in between those. The most unclean are Jews, the most clean are the pure Aryans. Sold itself and basically changed European history because of that simple identification. third case in point, which is closer to home, beginning already in the 1920s, 1930s, people who studied the natural sciences were aware of the web of life, how interconnected the whole ecological system was, all parts with it, and the danger of disrupting the ecological order. And they found it impossible to communicate to people until somebody hit the brilliant idea of identifying with ecological disorder with pollution, and green with clean. Now, that doesn't really fit, by the way. It's not a very perfect metaphor, but once you've got that, it sold itself, and it sells itself to your generation. It really talks. Clean, unclean are universal human categories, and you can communicate across cultures very powerfully in this way. By Mary Douglas, Purity and Danger. It's not the last word on it. She's written further, and other people have refined her work, but brilliant analysis. Yes, Elizabeth?
Perhaps related to that, you get the notion of a psychological scapegoat.
Yes.
So what people find unacceptable inside themselves don't.
Yep, that's just part of that phenomena. That's part of that phenomena. There's just so much of it. I mean, just simple things like, why do we have showers every day? We don't need to. It's a cultural thing, but it latches to this sense of wanting to be clean. Why is it that unless I do my teeth every morning and every evening, but not lunchtime. I can have a meal lunchtime and there's no problems, I don't feel yucky, but if I have breakfast and don't clean my teeth, the whole day is wrong. And if I don't clean my teeth at night, I can't go to sleep. Dentists have promoted that one, and quite rightly so, and it's for good purposes, but it's just that basic desire to be clean and to be. Notice that the connection between clean and physical, the body. It's not an abstract idea, purity, but it has to do with embodied living, the way we experience the world as beings with a body, not as minds, but as bodies.
Friends had just lived in messier houses, but actually are ashamed to have people around because they feel unclean. I think sometimes,
But even the most messy person with the most messy environment will have a line around which they draw the circle. So very often most messy people are also the people that are very wary about contact with others and hate to be touched because they've drawn this line around themselves. That's okay, that can be chaos, disorder out here, but here I've got to keep things in order. And it can be clothes or it can be just contact. There's a funny sets of phenomena. Now, okay, let me just open this a bit. I won't be able to go very far on it. Now, to understand purity theologically rather than psychologically and sociologically, I've been talking about the sociology of clean, unclean, the way societies are organised. But now I want to jump into the notion of ritual purity, spiritual purity, theological purity. Spiritual purity is the opposite of what's holiness, and they are totally incompatible with each other. Just as darkness is compatible with light, so impurity is incompatible with holiness. Just as if you bring petrol into contact with fire, fire destroys petrol. So if you bring darkness into light, the light destroys the darkness. Holiness destroys that which is unclean because they are mutually incompatible, exclusive. And this is just not arbitrary, it's the way things are. It's the way it is. So impurity is a life-denying, destructive power. It's incompatible with holiness like petrol with fire. So you need to be separated from impurity before you can before you can be admitted to God's presence. Next, impurity, as you all know instinctively, comes from contact. Defilement comes from contact with somebody or something unclean. So why is that people are averse to touching people who've got AIDS, or people who are dying, or touching corpses, or touching dirty people? It's because we have the sense in which impurity is communicated by contact with that which is unclean. It comes by way of physical contact. Now, spiritually speaking, the spiritual power of impurity comes from the desecration of what is holy. So impurity in itself has no power. It's parasitic power. It's power that comes from being perverted, robbed, stolen. So if you think of it, Satan has no power in himself. The only way he can build up his power is by desecrating holy people, holy things, the holy things of God. So it's parasitic power. It's a kind of Viagra that comes from the abuse of what is good and holy. Now, the next point is very, very important. Everywhere in all societies, Mary Douglas points out that human beings divide the world into two domains. There's the clean domain, which is my domain, my body, my house, my village, my tribe, my people. We're clean, but then the others are unclean. So impurity is always placed or located outside oneself in other human beings. Human beings are regarded as the source of impurity. Now, in the Old Testament, New Testament, the teaching is that no human being, even the most depraved and most wicked, is intrinsically unclean. Just as no human being is intrinsically holy, no human being is intrinsically unclean, because every human being is made in the image of God. The source of impurity lies in the demons. The demons are the unclean spirits. They are the source of all impurity. And ultimately behind all demons lies Satan himself. Okay, pause there. If any of you want an essay, I've written an essay in which I summarize the theology of holiness in the Bible. If any of you want to read that, just email me and I'll send you a copy rather than wasting a lot of paper printing it off. If you want it, just email me.
Is that the reference in the bibliography?
It's the reference in the bibliography, yes. Sharing in God's holiness. Okay? If you want to access it yourself, you can. The reference is there. But if you want it directly, email. I'm happy to email it through to you.